Thank you so much, Secretary Carter, for being with us. Really appreciate it. Before we get into our conversation, I'm a big history buff. And when I was preparing for this interview, I thought, well, we're going to be talking about the relationship between technology companies and the Department of Defense and other government agencies. I wonder if there's anything interesting in the historical record about that. So as I do, I went to YouTube, and I ended up somehow in this archive of old DoD public service announcement videos where they were teaching their contractors to modernize their operations and implement things like robotic manufacturing processes. And I found this amazing 30-minute video called Command Performance from 1963 that was made by the Air Force and sent to all their contractors. And I want to play just a minute-long clip from that because I think it's an amazing time capsule of a more innocent era in government technology relations.
Okay.
Let's take a look.
This robot manipulator will perform a variety of handling operations.
Yeah, I love the music.
It can be easily taught to load, unload, and assemble parts because of its electronic brain. So you see, we have practically all the elements of our plan of the future. It's just a matter of time before someone puts them all together to make the dream a reality. I don't know that anyone has ever produced a crystal ball on one of these machines, but you don't need to be a fortune teller to realize that our success in aerospace depends upon our national capability to produce combat-ready systems with complete reliability.
So that was how we approached this subject back in 1963. Obviously, a lot's changed since then. We now have technology companies that are teaching the government things about automation and manufacturing and robotics rather than the other way around. You also have, as we heard earlier today, employees within these technology companies that are sort of standing up and saying, well, actually, we don't know that we want to be defense contractors. What do you think has changed between now and then?
Well, I mean, first of all, to those employees who raised those questions, were I their leadership, I would say a couple of things, and I think you're thinking of Maven, Project Maven at Google, and examples like that, and the goggles at Microsoft. You heard from Brad Smith earlier, who's a very, very good thinker in this field. And I think the first thing you have to say to young people who raise things, and this was true of troops, and it's true of young people, including the ones I teach today, my first reaction is, good on you, because you're thinking morally. And you're thinking about whether what you're doing is right or wrong. That's good. I arrive at a different conclusion in this case than yours, but let's start with commending you for that. And on that particular case, the Google case, if you want me just to say what else I'd say, the first thing I'd say is that this is the United States. I was the Secretary of Defense, and we take our values to the battlefield. I never made any apologies about that. We were the U.S. military, and I expected us to conduct ourselves in a manner that was consistent with what you all would, in general, at least, think was necessary, but also done appropriately. And in respect of AI-assisted weapons, so-called autonomous weapons, robotic weapons, which the New York Times was one of the earliest to raise, and it may have been in response to that, that in 2012, I was the #2 in the department, the COO, before I became the CEO. And I issued a directive, which is still extant. You can all go out and read it. And it says that the department, in any application of machine-assisted weaponry that involves the use of lethal force, there shall be a human being involved in decision-making. And the reason I did, and this is 2012.
But sorry, I want to unpack that a little bit, because there's this human in the loop idea. There's been a lot of talk about.
That's the wrong. Technically, that's incorrect.
Also, but to boil it down, anytime there's a use of lethal force, there has to be a human making the decision about how that autonomous technology is implemented.
Yes, because they have to be accountable for an act that is the gravest thing you can do on behalf of our community. And when we made mistakes, and we did, I took responsibility for them, and then I attributed responsibility to them. And compare that, say, the Russians in Syria, and that's an important value for us to have. So I make no apologies about that.
Sure, and I want to.
You expect that. If I come out to a microphone the morning after we have done a strike or a raid, and women and children have been killed, and I come out and you're in the audience, Kevin, or others, your colleagues, and I say, well, I don't know how it happened, the machine did it. You'd crucify me, and you should. So it needs to be built into the use of force. That's a pretty serious matter.
What about the sort of things that we've heard about the design of these systems being flawed? I mean, earlier today we heard Brad Smith talking about not wanting to contract with a law enforcement department who wanted to use facial identification in body cams, not because there were sort of, only ethical concerns, but also practical concerns. The technology wasn't good enough. Do you worry that the DoD or military will implement these technologies so that even if there is a human at the end of the decision process pushing the button, that the sort of identification and the AI that happened in the process before that will have led them to a flawed set of choices?
Yeah, worried about it, yes, and therefore need to be vigilant. But Kevin, that's true outside of defense. It's true and we have seen cases where technology is leading us to a dark place. And even as that can happen in the Department of Defense, it can happen elsewhere. And in fact, it's happening, in my judgment, much more prevalently out there when it has to do with the rest of people's lives and their quality of life and their privacy and the way they are led to behave with respect to their fellow citizens and so forth. That's sadly rampant. And that's one of the themes of this conference. I feel in my new life, that is my crusade. It's now technology and public purpose is the issue of our time, whether it's in digital or biotech, jobs and training. We can't have a good and cohesive society if we don't get on top of it. So of course I worry about it.
I want to circle back to the work you're doing now. First, I want to put my cards on the table, which is that I come from a Quaker family. My family are all pacifists, anti-military activists, some of them. My grandfather in World War II was a conscientious objector, so he refused military service under ethical grounds and instead did an alternative form of service during the war. How is the work that these employees at these technology companies are doing, where they're objecting to the use of their work in military applications, how is that different than what conscientious objectors in other settings have done?
It's not essentially different. And again, I'd say the same to conscientious objectors and to Quaker. By the way, I had a stepmother who was one of the least quiet Quakers probably you've had. The spirit moved her a lot. And that is fine. Again, I land it in a different place. I do believe that we need to defend our people and try to make a better world, and that requires. Hopefully, our military is mostly used to prevent war and prevent violence. But when it's not, it's necessary to not only protect our people, but the things that we stand for, to defend it. To me, that is a noble calling, and I would tell troops, what you're doing is one of the noblest things you can do with your life, which is protect our people and make a better world for our children. So I understand where they're coming from, and I relate to it because I want to be good also in how I conduct myself. But I think that in the matter of protection, it's not a game. We don't do it just for the hell of it. We do it because we have to do it. And so I disagree, respectfully disagree, but they're thinking morally, and that's a good thing all by itself.
And what did you think of the suggestion that my colleague David Gellist raised with Brad Smith today about what if these tech companies broke off separate defense arms, so you would have Amazon Defense and Microsoft Defense and Facebook Defense, so that the employees who are working on these projects would be the ones who self-selected, who said, I'm okay working on this military technology, and you wouldn't worry about, you wouldn't have what happened in Microsoft where a bunch of people said, we didn't sign up for this.
Well, I know what Brad said, but a couple observations on that. First of all, just speaking for the department, I would regret that, because I think, as you indicated in the times when that movie was made, everything of consequence that happened in technology, first of all, happened in America, and secondly, happened in the government's precincts in one way or another, largely the defense departments. We're still, the Defense Department's still a big dog, but not nearly as preponderant. So I depend upon the rest of industry, just like I depend upon the labor markets to provide me with troops. We are part of the society, and I need them to give us our best stuff. Now, to employees, there's an issue in any company. I mean, I would not like to be associated with plenty of products out there, not because they're Defense Department products, but I wouldn't want to have anything to do with it. And that's a fair judgment to make if you take a job. And if you look at the whole portfolio of what a technology company is, I at least find a lot of things more objectionable than helping your country protect you. Our country is a platform that we all live atop. And you have to have some care about intending for that. How did you get here today? Well, you drove the roads. Do you have employees? Yeah. Well, can they read and write? Where does all this stuff come from? It comes from the things that we have decided we can only do well and decently collectively. So government isn't some add-on or enemy thing. It is the way we do those things that must be done where it would be impossible or inappropriate for it to be done for profit. And so we band together and do that in our government. And one of those is defense of ourselves and what we stand for.
How much do you think this sort of backlash among some Silicon Valley employees about working with the military is due to Trump? I mean, if you play out the alternate timeline
Sure.
where we're having, the Clinton administration, do you think there would be similar levels of objection to working with the government?
I'm going to guess that it is a amplifier of that concern, but I wouldn't go to the other extreme and say there wouldn't be any of it, and that wouldn't be warranted. And so if you're a leader of an organization, and I was the leader of the largest organization in the world, there are always people who have something to say. And that's fine, and they have their say, and you listen respectfully, and then you decide what you must do as an organization. And they don't have to. It's an all-volunteer force. You don't like it, you can leave, but we have to go in this direction. So I think it's a fair thing to challenge your leaders, always, on anything. But then you need to make it, and you try to influence them and get them to do what you regard as the right thing. And if that fails, you have to go off and do something else. And that's true for troops, and it's true for employees at a tech company.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what you're doing now. And one question outside of the Department of Defense, you've been writing a lot recently about the challenges that government has in addressing technology and regulation, a lot of the questions we've been hearing about today. You wrote about the Mark Zuckerberg hearings in Congress that you thought that was a missed opportunity. Explain why you thought that was a missed opportunity.
Well, here was a case in which an issue that is, all the polling shows people are very alive to. They are concerned about where their information is going, whether it's who's exploiting it, who's protecting it. So you have a leader of a major tech company facing our elected representatives, and my idea of a good outcome of that would have been that everybody seemed to understand and suggest what is true, which is that some mix of regulation and self-regulation by companies is necessary.
You don't think they had a nuanced discussion of the
No, I mean,
pros
that's
and
the
cons?
problem. And wouldn't you love to hearing in which there were
I was right there, by the way. I was
options?
about 3 rows behind Mark Zuckerberg. It was I
were
called it a 5-hour tech support
a part
call.
of history that
It was a circus.
A part of history that didn't happen. I joke that I wish in my many appearances before congressional committees on issues of war and peace, they had been as poorly prepared to ask me questions and they were to ask Mark Zuckerberg questions. And for his part, I don't think he gave answers that are going to stand in the great arc of history either. And that's something that needs to be improved. Well, look, we need to land this plane, right? We need to get somewhere with this and decide what is that mix of regulation, intelligent regulation and self-regulation. Is it 80-20? Is it 20-80? How can you do that? I would love to see those options discussed instead of this sort of grope. And so it was an historic opportunity miss. You know, we pick ourselves up and we go on, and then I went on to say how I would, I have some recommendations about how I think we can design better expertise and help to our elected representatives, because I've been part of that several times in the course of my life, so I think I know what it takes to get us to the point where members understand enough. They have that the technical people can put out there well thought out options, and then they can do what they do best, which is apply their broad judgment to represent their people and pick one of those.
Maybe we should set up kind of like a congressional genius bar, where the members can go and ask their technology questions before the hearings?
There was such a thing once upon a time. This is a little ancient history, but it's germane. My very first entree to all this, I was a physicist. Physics is my background. And the generation that came before me were the atomic bomb people. And they inculcated in us the conviction that with great power, which you have by dint of knowledge and the ability to make change, comes responsibility. So along came a problem, which is going to be ancient history now, but peak of the Cold War, we had a 10-warhead ICBM called the MX missile. Where do you put it so that the Soviets then Soviets can't destroy it in half an hour? Necessary because, as you all know, a vulnerable weapon is bad for the possessor and the beholder. And they wanted to put together a scientific panel, and these elders who had been part of the bomb said, Ash, you need to go do this just 1 year. Take a year off. And go. So I went down there, and here's how the thing operated, just to cut to the chase. It had been decided by the leaders of both parties in both houses that this was a problem that warranted attention. That's step one. So some things wouldn't meet that criterion. You can imagine what they are, but they'd say, no, I don't want that studied. This met and that's the first thing. So they set us to work, a small group of scientists, and we also had a group of formers, moose heads of great experience overseeing us to make sure that we didn't get off track and that we were quality controlled. And then we listened to every conceivable constituency, and this is tiring. For example, I designed a 14 million cubic foot airship to put this sucker on, which wouldn't be a popularity contest winner, but we looked at everything that flew, moved, so that the Soviet Union couldn't know where it was and they couldn't attack it, and that'd be a pretty wacky idea, but somebody had it, and so I gave it a respectful hearing. And every lobbyist, hawks and doves, members, staffers, everybody in the relevant departments of the executive branch around the country, the states that would be affected, we heard everybody, so that no one could say they hadn't had a shot. And then we didn't give answers, we gave options. And that was a safe product for members to request, because what they don't want is something jammed down their throat. And expertise, which is a good thing, masquerading as universal expertise, that is, as a decision that the government ought to make, and we ought to all be clear about that. We may know a lot about something, but that's not the same as deciding. And these are the people who are supposed to decide. That's a good formula right there. The members have decided they need it. You got some people overseeing it to make sure it doesn't get off the rails. You give a respectful hearing to all, and then you land it with a number of options. Now, had that preceded the Zuckerberg hearing, and there was an 80-20 mix and a 50-50 mix and a 20-80 mix, that would have been a pretty good outcome. Then people could have debated that and gone away and voted on that, and we'd be somewhere rather than nowhere.
Luckily, I don't think that's his last time testifying before Congress, so we might have another whack at this.
We need to do better.
I want one more question, and then I want to open it up for a couple audience questions. You just mentioned that you grew up as a physicist. You came into academia as a physicist, and this was at a time when a lot of people who had been involved in the Manhattan Project were expressing great regret about their role in developing the atomic bomb, feeling like they had blood on their hands, as Robert Oppenheimer famously said to President Truman. Do you think that the students that you're teaching now at Harvard, you have to go back and teach a class right after this, do you think they are being educated in a way that is similar to the way that maybe physics education changed after the atomic bomb?
I'm trying, because it's not a matter of jamming it down their throats. The appetite is high. This generation knows something's wrong. I mean, these kids know, and I teach big groups of people about digital life, bio, jobs and training, and they come from not from the engineering school, the science departments, MIT, but also the law school, the medical school, the business school, the Kennedy School. And there's a hunger there, and their deans call me and say, Ash, now that you're here, and this is one of the B's you had in your bonnet as Secretary of Defense, can you help me figure it out? Because my students are they're doing their own Maven kind of thing within the departments, and say, I'm getting this whole education to be a lawyer, and nobody's teaching me what is right and wrong in this new technology space, and that doesn't feel right to me. Can I get a little help? And that's an appetite that is commendable, and we ought to try to service it, and that's what I'm trying to do. And you know, one of the nice things about dealing with students all the time is they give you a heart, and you say, all right, whatever mess we're leaving to these folks. Seemed to have soldiers the same way. I used to, when I got fed up with Washington, I said, all right, let's go to see the troops. And then an hour or that, and you say, okay, I'm okay now. I can go back to Washington.
Well, we'll let you get back to your troops pretty soon, but I want to take a couple questions from the audience. Q&A, we have mics going around. Yeah, right there.
So I was just curious on your opinion on the sort of, if you look at autonomy as kind of a spectrum with respect to a weapon system, what is the moral difference between, let's say, firing 6 Tomahawk missiles at a village where people might wander into the frame, as it were, versus releasing a drone swarm of 100 autonomous friend or foe identifying drones with lethal weaponry that could kill the enemy as effectively, perhaps with the same precision?
Not a lot of difference, and you know that, and I know that, and when we, I assume you would agree with that, when we conclude that, we are concluding that we can continue to see our own values even as they show up in some other technical form. That's really crucial. And that's why I say, to me, human understanding, I mean, human responsibility, your leader's responsibility, the Geneva Convention, all our rules of engagement and how we try to behave ourselves decently on the battlefield, all that needs to go for. I don't care whether it's a new gizmo or not. You're potentially taking somebody's life. That's the common denominator. And darn it, you need to continue to find your way morally. So I think your question illustrates the big point. We don't leave behind everything we believe in this technology, and people are bamboozled by it. And one of the things I like to teach people and teach young people is here's enough to know about genetics or epigenetics or AI or something, even that you can navigate. You can have the confidence that you can know enough to behave and participate, and don't leave it to other people. You can get in the game and insist that they answer your question.
Great, thank you. We're out of time. Secretary Carter, thank you very much for coming out with us.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.